Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee still. And I thought I would do something a little different for a second informative video this morning because I've mentioned I read a lot. I read a lot of novels these days. Yes, I've read a lot of nonfiction, a lot of science text, a lot of physiology text. I read a lot of fiction these days again. And people have asked me, hey, what do you read? And I thought I would kind of break down for you guys what I'm reading, but I want a little bit of a premise to that so that you guys understand why I recommend reading, even for people who are pursuing fitness, because I believe that we should train both our minds and our bodies. I think it's very important, something I've believed in for a very, very long time. And if you go back historically, even the ancient Greek philosophers, the great thinkers of their era, understood the value of physical exercise and fitness. They considered it essential. And these are, again, the people whose philosophies have been the pillars of Western civilization. They understood this. And I think you find that in a lot of Eastern cultures also, that again, there's this connection between the mind and the body that needs to be taken seriously, that you need to train both. They both need to be healthy. They both need to be robust. And they do go hand in hand. And we know that based upon research now with older individuals, that there is an enormous correlation between things like leg strength and cognition. In other words, people who have physical strength and muscle mass as they get older get dementia at lower rates, they get Alzheimer's at lower rates, and more importantly, we found an enormous correlation between the leg strength once you're in your 60s, leg strength and cognitive function. In other words, memory. They go hand in hand. So again, this whole idea that physical fitness and intense training is purely for meatheads and not intellectuals is absolutely not true. And conversely, people who train need to understand that there is value in your mental attributes and training your brain as well. And what I want to get into with that is understanding the recovery aspects of it. There is something inherently relaxing about sitting down and reading a book. In fact, if you compare that to, say, sitting down to watch television during your downtime to relax, you actually get totally different brain hormones, different function in your body. I personally find that sitting down and reading for 3 to 4 hours every day, while just chilling, laying down, get everything put in a position where my legs can rest and recover from my training, because I squat and deadlift every day, I find it works wonders for that. And it allows a different form of brain stimulation than other things that we do. Instead of the mindless things going on with the television and the blue light, reading a book doesn't produce those same effects. It doesn't interfere with your sleep and things later. It doesn't interfere with the quality of your sleep. It doesn't do the same things with your brain waves. Whereas in this is, again, it has a more relaxing effect on the body, it has a more relaxing effect on the brain chemistry, and it stimulates your brain more. Well, stimulating cognitive function in a variety of ways is actually beneficial towards physical function, because again, the cognition tends to go hand in hand with different things. I mean, this sort of stuff can in the long term enhance your recovery, possibly enhance neuromuscular efficiency. It's a good thing all around. And it helps you just to get different viewpoints and to think. Now, I love fiction these days, and one of the things I want to point out with that before I jump into what I'm reading, fiction can teach you a lot of things, but you got to also remember a good fiction writer can help you suspend your disbelief, particularly with things like fantasy. And I remember a perfect example of something that some of my friends years ago, we had all read a similar novel, and I forget which one it was, and there was a point in there, total myth, but they thought it applied to the real world. And it was this scenario where this guy had found an arrowhead out in the woods, and he realized looking at it that because of the angle that the arrow was compared to the notch in the back, the knock in the arrow, that it was designed to kill people, not for hunting, because of the angle of the ribs of an animal is vertical and in humans it's horizontal. It was designed to slip through the ribs that way. Well, that's not true, because an arrow spins. So it was complete nonsense relative to the angle of the notch versus the blades on the arrowhead. It sounded great in fiction, but of course it's not based on reality. But an amusing point. That aside, though, you do get some interesting things. You can learn to think. You can learn to learn things about just different intrigue and political intrigue and the way that people think and manipulation and everything that goes on with some of these stories. And they're just interesting because you can find certain trends in the way people think. They can carry over to the real world in certain cases. because again, most authors are fairly cerebral thinkers. Now, one of my favorite authors in what I'm reading right now is Terry Brooks. And what's different about him, he was one of my favorite authors as an adolescent, as a teenager. And what I found later, a lot of the people whose stuff I read when I was younger turned out to be total hacks. Their novels were okay when you're younger, but then you realize they really suck as a writer as you get older. They're just hacks who crank out tons of books. Like R.A. Salvatore was one of my favorites when I was younger as a teenager, and now I realize his books kind of suck. He wasn't a very good author. Whereas in Terry Brooks, he became better as he wrote. Like, he had only written a handful of books when I started reading him, and like The Sword of Shannara. I've got the original trilogy here that he wrote. The first book he wrote in 1977, The Sword of Shannara. And then when I was 12 years old, 13 years old, I thought it was pretty good. But when I look back at it, in a lot of ways, it was kind of a token ripoff. It wasn't a particularly fantastic book. It was okay. But he set a premise for the world as far as a setting that had so much potential. And what I found is he expanded this trilogy, and he wrote some other stuff also. As he expanded this whole series on this trilogy, he went back and he wrote books going back to in the past, going back thousands of years in the past leading to it, and then he wrote books moving forward in the future in his world. So he's written in like a span of over 3,000 years of a set of a storyline. And what's fascinating with it is that as he wrote more books, he became a much, much better writer. Like, his original works I thought were okay as a teen, and for a teenager they're decent quality. For an adult, I would say his original trilogy, it's not particularly great reading for a more mature adult lifter. It really isn't. It's okay. It's okay, but I'd give it 3 stars, 3 out of 5. But his potential to be a good writer was there with his writing style. But as he wrote, because a lot of the books, he didn't write them in order. Like, he jumps back and forth in the order that he writes them over the years. And as he goes, he gets better and better. And I don't have the first couple of books as far as the timeline goes, because he wrote those much, much later, like over 20 years after he started writing. His original trilogy, that's the origin of these stories, he wrote like 15, 20 books deep. It's called The Word in the Void. And those are fantastic books. They are fantastic books. I loaned them out to a friend right now a couple weeks ago who wanted to read them. She'll get them back to me later when she's done, and she'll probably want to borrow the next book. So I don't have those to show you. But he's one of those writers that got much better in time. And this whole set of books right now is about 30 books. And he's got 2 more that he's still writing that are going to be released over the next few years, hopefully before the guy dies. He's in his 70s. I don't want him to die before he finishes them. But I'm about 20 books deep right now. Because I read the original 3, and then I read the next one after it as a teenager, then I dropped it. I didn't read any of this series again, but I started reading it again this year. So people are like, wait, you're like 20 books deep, and one of the first one's over 700 pages. Yeah, I reread that. What I did, I bought all of them. So I have all of them. I have a lot of them in hardback. I started reading these a couple months ago. Yeah, I started reading these after I built my home gym, this series again, to put it in perspective. So I knock out a lot of books. I try to knock out 2 or 3 novels every week. So I'm about 20 books deep, and now I'm right now on the High Druid of Shannara trilogy. I'm in the 2nd book in that trilogy, so I think that's book 21. It might be number 21 is where I'm at, as far as the chronology in which these go. And what I really like about him is that he does tie the stuff in, meaning there are certain themes and things that fall back and forth, even though we get to a point to where some of the other books are so far back in history that obviously no one knows necessarily about the original storylines, because some of them get kept up and handed down through family lines and things, and some of them get kind of documented, and so there's some references that the people know, but then you have references in there that tie back to larger themes and storylines going back that you get ties back through all the way through the years. And it's just an interesting situation he has as far as the continual struggle between good and evil. And what's always interesting to me is that he always seems to have a group of people, an order of people there who are in a way anti-heroes. It starts out with like the Knights of the Word, and then it later becomes the Druids and everything. Even though their powers seem to come from a different source, it's still the same basic concept that they're a source of overall good. But they do things kind of in their own way, and they're manipulators and everything else, and they keep secrets to themselves while they do this. And then what's interesting is that then later, due to what happens about 8 books deep, which kind of is referred as the book that was written before the original one, you have a whole family line that ends up getting tied up with all their magic. And then that family line, for book after book, it just continues to be important. And all through there, they're oftentimes kind of at odds with the Druids because they know they're manipulated by them, and they end up being friends with them and stuff. But their family line always seems to kind of get manipulated a little bit to kind of push towards the greater good. And then eventually they end up getting merged, and a member of their family ends up becoming the last Druid for a while. So it's interesting stuff, and that's kind of where this goes with the High Druid of Shannara, is basically rebuilding of the Druid Council and stuff going on with it. But I'm really not giving you guys the whole summary because these books are a lot more complex than that. And what I like here is that it's fantasy, but there's always a spattering of sci-fi, and you're not always going to get the sci-fi from book to book. Because essentially what we have is a situation to where, without giving much of it away, it's basically Earth after a nuclear apocalypse. So what we end up happening is that there was higher technology, and then there's always a technology theme that occasionally gets inserted back in. And you get that feeling in the original trilogy that is this Earth? Is this something that's happened later in the future after something's gone catastrophic on Earth? You kind of dropped hints at that, and that actually turns out to be the case. And the original books give you the full storyline going all the way back to current time in North America. And then going into an apocalyptic setting. But so there always maintains a small theme of science, but it's always also sometimes a conflict between science and magic is always involved to some extent. But these books are fantastic. They're well written. Once you get further in, meaning after he's got about 5 or 6 books under his belt, he becomes a much better writer. So it's kind of one of the things, it's like if you read them in the order he wrote them, which again starts kind of in the middle. It starts at like book 9 as far as the timeline goes, the Sword of Shannara. You'll notice he evolves as a writer much more. Whereas then if you read them chronologically like I'm doing right now, I went back and started with the very first stuff, and I'm reading them in the order they're supposed to happen throughout time. It does make for an interesting read because you can jump back and see at the points, because he jumps back and forth multiple times while he's writing them in order, that you can tell where he becomes a better author or not, and where his ability to write and tell good stories improves over time. So it's kind of interesting to observe it that way. So you will need to anticipate that if you were to grab this series of books and read it, starting with, say, The Word and the Void, and then read it all the way through. You'll notice that some of the books aren't really as well written, but if you go back and look, it's because he wrote that book 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And the ones that he's written in the last decade tend to be a lot better because he's evolved as a writer. So just something to be aware of if you choose to read this. But yeah, definitely one of my favorite series of books. I already have a couple other authors I have set aside who have some experience with it. I'm going to read like 10 or 15 of their books in a row as I jump through, but I want to finish out all of my Terry Brooks first, because I have, again, I've got a couple more trilogies of this sitting on the shelf. I'm not going to read the last series until he finishes it. And then I've got like another hardback collection of like 6 of his books and another series sitting on hardback that I got a good deal on the whole collection. So I've got those to read after. And then I'll jump to another author. And I might make some videos telling you guys kind of what I'm reading later as it goes on. Because people ask. They genuinely want to know what I'm reading because it's a big part of my recovery. Well, after I'm done training and stuff, that's a big deal. A lot of times in between workouts, because I tend to film everything in the morning. And YouTube is my full-time job. So after I'm done training, or different points when I take breaks from training, I chill, take a hot bath, and read sometimes for an hour, then go do my next workout session. So it's kind of a big part of what I do during my downtime, just because of the relaxation factor combined with some mental stimulation. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.